Well, thanks everybody for being here and bringing this awesome weather that we were not counting on, but we're psyched that it's here. And yeah, really excited for the day. And I'm kind of gonna, you could think of this presentation as like wetting your whistle, basically. It's gonna be an introduction to forest farming, kind of a focus on the Northeast, an introduction to some of the ideas and topics, but maybe just quickly, like I'd love to see a show of hands of who here is actively forest farming already, considers themselves a forest farmer. Okay, so a minority. And then how many people are here with the intention to get into forest farming like in the next few years? Okay, great. Perfect. Well, I think this will be a great introduction, and then we've got lots of time throughout the day to get in the field, get your hands dirty, and get into specific topics. So, all right, it's working. Really quickly, I guess just an introduction to who I am. My name's Karam. I am one of the co-directors of the NFFC, so I've been working with Walker and Marlise and many others on the team for a number of years now. I'm originally from Ohio and went to Ohio State. And my sort of like first experience with forest farming was right after graduating from college. I did AmeriCorps volunteering with this organization called Rural Action, which is in Southeast Ohio. So it was about an hour from where I grew up. Very different part of the state. That's the Appalachian portion of Ohio. So you go from the maybe what most people picture as the sort of the flat cornfields of Ohio to a very different topography, geography, cultural environment. Rural Action was a community development organization that worked to uplift the rural communities in that part of the state. There's a lot of folks that had land but were financially struggling. And so forest farming was an approach that Rural Action was using and had been using for decades to work with people to do economic development, cultural revitalization, and also to achieve these environmental outcomes. And so for me, I had taken maybe one forestry class in college. That sort of totally changed my perspective on forestry and what you could do with forest resources. Really great experience. And John Munsell is probably in the other session, but we've got some folks here that were part of an Appalachian coalition that's very similar to what we've tried to replicate here in the Northeast. And that level of organizing was also very interesting. So then I decided I want to stick with this and ended up at the Yale School of Forestry to get a master's in forestry. And it kind of went from there. I started doing forest farming research and we moved toward developing this coalition. So that's kind of my background. Now I'm in a PhD program back at Yale Forestry, still studying this stuff. And so some of the research that we'll maybe see today if we get out into the field is actually part of my PhD research. So that's kind of who I am and where I'm coming from. But to start off with just a few definitions, it's not definition heavy, but forest farming. At its sort of most basic, you can think of forest farming as utilizing the shade of a natural forest to create a conducive growing environment for the crops that you're interested in growing, right? And so that is one of the key ways that forest farming differs from the way that most people think about growing crops, right? You're thinking open sun, maybe you're thinking annual agriculture. In forest farming systems, that shade is actually key. And when we talk about the focal crops in a forest farming system, you'll hear this term thrown around quite a bit in this world of forest farming, non-timber forest products, or NTFPs. I might say that. That's what I'm talking about. And pretty intuitive definition, it's basically anything that comes out of a forest that has a commercial value or a use value. It's a useful product that's not timber. And you'll see broader or more narrow versions of this, of definitions of this term. But when we're talking about forest farming systems and non-timber forest products, there's quite a range of different non-timber forest products that can be integrated into a forest farming system. These are things like, we've got medicinal plants, edible plants, syrups, and then there are ornamental plants, right? Things like mountain laurel wreaths is something that we see down in southern Connecticut. That's a non-timber forest product. here are just some examples of different types of products that can be integrated into a forest farming system. We've got, in this slide, black walnuts, we've got shiitake mushrooms, we've got maple syrup and ramps, we've got pawpaws. And one of the really cool things about forest farming, because you are working in an intact forest system, you've got vertical structure. You've gone from a two-dimensional farming system on the ground to an actual like a three-dimensional system. And so one of the really cool things with forest farming is sometimes you'll hear, this is maybe a bit of an academic term, but multi-strata agroforestry. But it's this idea that you're actually able to cultivate crops vertically in your understory, in your mid-story, like a pawpaw is not full-size canopy tree, that's kind of a mid-story tree. And then you've got a canopy tree like a black walnut, so you've got that vertical structure. So it allows you to actually pack quite a bit in. If you know, you'll often hear like, we look at say like a cornfield and you think, man, we're really maximizing production. But forest farming is an opportunity to think, well, we can actually go, if we go up, you know, all of a sudden you can come up with a very a dynamic and diverse system packed into a small footprint. Another type of non-timber forest product, and this is what we're going to primarily be focused on today, are understory herbs. And you'll sometimes hear these referred to as forest botanical species. And these are largely medicinal and edible species, that many of which have pretty substantial commercial markets. So that's something we're going to talk about a little bit. And just to zoom in for a second on some of the sort of primary suspects, I guess, that we'll be spending a lot of time on at this conference. American ginseng. Who all here is familiar with American ginseng? Yeah. So I feel like this is kind of the poster child of forest farming systems in the eastern U.S. And that's for cultural reasons. There's a lot of rich, kind of very dynamic cultural history that Anna could talk to you all day about and will, I'm sure, hit on in her session. But also because it's a very commercially valuable plant. So it's often the centerpiece or like the starting point for a lot of people. Start with ginseng and then you kind of branch out. And those are some of the reasons. Something I'll just note about all of these herbs that we'll be talking about today, they're long-lived perennial plants. Perennial meaning that they are putting up a top year after year that then dies back. And the primary commercial part of the plant is actually that underground root. So that's ginseng. Golden seal is another one of our species of special interest. This is again one that has a relatively significant market around it. We're kind of getting into the northern part of golden seal's range here in Vermont and in New England in general, but there are kind of scattered wild populations, and I'm going to talk about this a little later. One of the neat things about forest farming is that we're reintroducing these plants onto parts of their historic range. And so just because the populations are relatively dispersed or disjunct, doesn't mean you can't forest farm them. So one other one that I wanted to highlight, ramps. This is pretty widespread. Yeah, delicious. This is one of our edibles and pretty widespread across the Northeast. So does anybody have ramps on their property growing? Yeah. Wow. See?
No, you don't tell.
Yeah. I'm like, can you give me your names? No. Great. Yeah, we love ramps. So I just wanted to highlight, this is cool. This is actually from some of the surveying that we've done through the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition. Some of the reasons that people are reporting, like why you're interested in forest farming. And this is, I think, cool to highlight because my main takeaway from this is that it's actually a really diverse set of reasons that people are kind of coming to this practice. And I think one of the strengths that we've found over the years of organizing in this coalition model is that people don't have to come for the sort of the same reasons, right? Like it's a broad tent, and we're really happy that people are coming to this with different sort of perspectives. But you've got like a very environmentally motivated perspectives, right? Ecological land stewardship, forest restoration. You've got more economically motivated, passive income. You got a wildlife habitat. So this is great. And like Walker was sort of highlighting, forest farming can actually accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. Another thing I just wanted to point out is that it's also a really applicable practice for the region that we're in. So New England specifically, we're 80% forested in the region, and 87% of that forest is privately owned. And I don't know if I have the number on there, but yeah, 50% of that is in small parcels, under 10 acres. So when you think about that, and you think about maybe other kind of like things you could do with that forest land to derive some income from it, there's like carbon projects or there's timber. Well, those things are maybe not as good of a fit for small parcels under 10 acres. But forest farming is actually a way that you can derive income from a small parcel, small footprint. It's very hands-on. So I just like to highlight that because, and also when you're thinking from a like a restoration or conservation perspective, it's not like we're out west and all of New England is one national forest and you can just, you know, make a proclamation and conserve it. It's like you actually need to engage small landowners. So from a technical assistance perspective, forest farming is a really great way to get people thinking about their woods, thinking about conservation. So another word, another definition, agroforestry. Have many of you, how many people have heard the term agroforestry? Okay, so the USDA is, they maintain definitions for things. It's part of their job. And there are 5 recognized agroforestry practices through the USDA. Forest farming is one of them, along with windbreak, silvopasture, alley cropping, and riparian forest buffers. And so Kate McFarland, who's running the other session, is sort of like the agroforester for the USDA. She's really awesome. It's been a huge resource for us. But this stuff matters when you're trying to unlock funding for things. So according to the USDA, they've got this idea of the 4 I's. Like for a practice to be agroforestry, it has to be intentional, intensive, integrated, and interactive. And so the example that you'll sometimes hear is if you just have a wild ramp patch, is that really agroforestry? And I think the USDA would say, well, not really, because it wasn't intentional. It was just there. That's kind of splitting hairs, but I think it's worth noting because some of you may in the future or may already have applied for farmer grants. And these are the kinds of things that end up kind of mattering when you're applying for a farmer grant. And that's something that I think we want to highlight we can be a resource for if that's something that you end up doing. So that's a definition, but I also want to just talk about production systems because these plants can be produced intentionally in a wide range of systems. And one really cool thing about Smokey House is that at this point, over the past few years, we've been setting up different demonstration sites, doing plantings, and I'm pretty sure every production system I'm going to talk about, you can actually see here on the property. So I want to highlight these. This is really more of a spectrum, but I'm kind of broken this out into a couple different approaches. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got what we call wild stewarding. And this is, like I mentioned, you've got a native, congratulations, you've got a native population of ramps on your property. That's awesome. And you're interested in selling those ramps, using them for personal consumption, whatever it is. Wild stewarding is bringing a degree of intentionality into that management, right? Like, and I'm sure that most people are aware that, you know, they're occasionally when it comes to wild populations, there are unsustainable approaches to harvesting. And you'll have people that will go out and see ramps and just harvest the whole patch. And, you know, they're like, yeah. And wild stewarding is bringing that degree of intentionality in. It's collecting the seeds and it's replanting them. It's being deliberate about where you're harvesting from. Like maybe rather than just starting in a corner and going left to right, you harvest a bit here and a bit here, and like you're moving around. So wild stewarding, and that's great if you're lucky enough to have a wild population. We then have something that we call wild simulated production. And the idea with wild simulated production is that you are going into a forest environment that, based on your assessment of the characteristics of that forest, and we'll talk about this a little bit, you've determined that this is actually an environment where you could really expect to see these plants growing naturally, but I'm not seeing them. Wild simulated, you're going and actually introducing those plants into that forest environment, but after that, you're walking away and you're letting those plants grow as if they were just wild plants. So I would say the vast majority of forest farming at the small scale is happening through a wild simulated approach because it's low cost, it's low labor. You're kind of like letting those plants do their thing. So that's wild simulated, and you know, you'll notice it's like similar forest environment, right? The woods looks the same. in these systems. We then have something that we call woods grown production. And so, does anyone know what this plant is?
Ginseng.
Yeah, it's ginseng. So that's just a carpet of ginseng on the floor. And I'll just tell you, you would never find ginseng growing like this naturally. And ginseng in particular just cannot handle that kind of density. Like it's really susceptible to like fungal diseases. So the only way that that system is existing is through regular and very heavy applications of fungicide. And even still, probably that has to be harvested in 3 years, or I would still kind of succumb. But you can see these are like raised beds, right? Built in the woods. So this is a really intensive version of woods grown cultivation, but in a woods grown system, you're really modifying that forest environment. You're changing the dynamics of the forest understory. You're maybe tilling the soil. You may be building raised beds. You're adding soil amendments, significant soil amendments. But you're still utilizing that natural shade, right, from the forest canopy. So we could think of this as a kind of in-between system. And finally, we've got field cultivation. And like this, again, that's more ginseng. This is a photo from Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is the state that's sort of the epicenter of like commercial ginseng production. And there's like, I think around 150 ginseng farms that produce the plants like this. And so if you buy like a Monster energy drink and it says ginseng, that's what you're drinking. So, and again, similar to a woods grown system, like the amount of inputs required to keep that kind of a ginseng operation going is very high. In fact, after 3 years, a field cultivated system like that builds up such a significant fungal load in the soil that you can never replant ginseng on that soil again. You have to move to another footprint. So these farms basically are like this shifting, so intense, right? So you could think of this as a production spectrum, and you've got increasing intensiveness, right, in inputs, increasing cost. Your yield is going up, right? But so is your risk. So when you're thinking about your own systems, and we're going to get into the nuance of this. Again, I mentioned that we have every type of production present here at Smokey House. We can actually look and see. We have all these systems going on. So we can actually see them in person and think about trade-offs. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So when it comes to starting your own forest farming operation, I wanted to just touch on planting material because there are, I guess, two primary ways that you could get started. The first is using seeds. I'm curious, does anyone recognize any of these seeds?
Yeah, those are wild leek seeds in the lower left-hand corner.
Yep. These are our leeks or ramp seeds. Anything else? Ginseng's down there. Anyone recognize this? This is black cohosh. And then I think somebody said bloodroot. Yeah. So, seed's great because it's cheap. And if you can find it, you can get it in pretty large quantities. So you can start with seed. People will also start by transplanting rootstock in. So I wanted to highlight those, and we'll get into in some of our sessions later today. We'll be able to talk a bit about these two systems or approaches. I wanted to zoom in a little bit on wild simulated forest farming because, again, the vast majority of people are using a wild simulated approach. And I'm curious, what are people, when you see this picture, I'll tell you this is a wild simulated operation. Is there anything that you've noticed, just any observations at all about this photo here?
Well, there's some diversity going on.
Diversity? It looks untouched, right? Like,
yeah, there's big clearing.
Good catch, yeah. So you can see in the foreground here, and there's some clearly, yeah, it's a gentle touch. That's a nice way of putting it. But absolutely, we're seeing diversity in the understory. We've got ferns. We've got a variety of different herbaceous species. Anything you want to observe about the canopy? Yeah, we've got a big light gap here. So it's, to use another academic term, it's heterogeneous. It's not just like this is actually the structure of this forest is pretty dynamic and diverse. Yeah, these are all great observations. So, well, let me think. This next slide, I think, yeah. That's exactly, so those are all great observations. When you're wild simulated forest farming, part of the objective of that system is to maintain an intact forest environment. And we'll get into how you select an appropriate planting site in a minute, but that is what a wild simulated system is going to look like. And if to the untrained eye, you would walk into a system like that and probably not know that wild simulated forest farming was even happening. A very common method, and we're going to get to do this in our next sessions for planting into a wild simulated system, is this broadcast seeding approach. And in particular, there's this method that I learned it as the Andy Hankins method. He was a cooperative extension agent in Virginia. Maybe he was the first guy to do this. But it's a system with rakes. Ideally, you have two people. You have a hard rake and a soft rake. And you can just very efficiently move across an entire kind of hillside, raking back the leaf litter, broadcast seeding, moving upslope, creating another row, raking down on top of that, and then you can just move across the whole hillside that way. Or if you're Anna and Justin, you use leaf blowers, but we can talk, I'll let her talk about that. But essentially, this is the biggest impact that you're going to have on that site. Removing the leaf litter, seeding in, walking away. And the sort of lowest intensity approach would be then you're done. You come back in 7 years and you check on your ginseng. But obviously there's nuance there. And like folks noticed in that last photo, which actually was taken at American Ginseng Farm. At Wild Hudson Valley. They were doing some thinning. Those are mostly, I think, striped maple, right? And so that's just very to open up some more light in the canopy. So there are things you can do, and there's definitely nuance there, but it can be very low labor. And I just this is looking down at Wild Hudson Valley, but this is sort of do we know what this is?
Ginseng.
Yeah, it's ginseng. So you got a ginseng plant here, here, here. And so the distribution of the plants on that landscape, compare that to the density in those woods grown systems, or it's a relatively natural density of plants on that landscape. So this is this is Japanese barberry. I don't really know why I put this in here. I think I was just trying to highlight
Okay, but it has Burberry in it, like the golden seal does, so it's worth noting that.
There you go.
What's funny is I know exactly where that picture is, and we dug roots from right below that barberry on Thursday.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's on our property?
Yeah. That's from this summer.
How did we not remove this invasive, in the middle of
Well,
our
I think I took a picture of
very
this.
well under.
Yeah, I took a picture of
I'm
it.
not saying to leave barberry. Please remove it, but
I remember we talked maybe the deer don't want to walk through this, and so the ginseng plants are thriving.
some of the plants that I'll show people in the workshop are from that spot. It's so weird.
Funny. So just a couple slides showcasing this woods grown approach, a couple more pictures because they're kind of wild systems, right? This is more ginseng. And I'm highlighting this though for a specific reason. It's not that I expect anyone is going to necessarily decide to put in 40 acres of ginseng and raise beds in their woods. Although if you want to, more power to you. This is Larry Harding, and he's a grower in Maryland, and he's sort of like the woods grown ginseng guy. I don't know too many people that have an operation at this scale, but it's a multi-generational family business, and he is definitely if you're going to go online and try to buy ginseng starts, for example, you're probably going to end up at Larry's website. And so I think it's important to highlight this example because if the alternative was to produce these, say, in a raised bed, I think it's a real open question, which is sort of what are the trade-offs, right? And I think that there are some advantages to a system like this. You're maintaining the forest canopy, right? And if you ever walk away from this system, you've got an intact forest. It'll probably stay forest. So, but
how does he keep that density? I mean, that is dense.
And without the fungal load you were
Exactly,
talking about.
or
Yeah.
the soil,
really cold.
or is it because it's in the
well, he would say that he doesn't.
naturally. No,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, he would say that he doesn't really have to use that many inputs, and I think it's an open question how, yeah. how true that is. Yeah, just fungicides. But you couldn't, yeah, even though this is happening in a forest, he's definitely amending this. Like, it wouldn't sort of sustain itself. But I wanted to highlight the woods grown approach because I think that something that's important to note is that even though I'm presenting these as if they're these really distinct, unique production systems, the truth is you can actually utilize different production systems on a small scale on your property in different environments for specific objectives. So I really like, this is a really cool system. This is at United Plant Savers, which is in Rutland, Ohio, Southeast Ohio. And you can't quite see this, but this is at the base of a slope. So you can picture like at the base of a slope here. And this is a planting of swamp white oak trees. There's like 3 rows of these trees. You don't really know why those swamp white oak went in the first place. But then and this is Tanner Filya is sort of, he runs a lot of the on-the-ground programming there. They built raised beds at the base of these swamp white oaks and planted a bunch of golden seal stock in that I believe was actually funded through the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition. And they're managing these beds for planting stock. So golden seal is one of those species that's rhizomatic. The root mass sort of spreads and puts up multiple growth buds. And so you can subdivide those roots. And I think if you end up in Margaret's session, you'll get to do some of that hands-on. And so these beds are being managed for a sustainable yield of planting stock that they sell then year after year. I would call this this is kind of a woods grown approach, right? But it's in this small footprint. It's there for a specific purpose. And so I want to highlight that because these production systems might actually have a role in your own operation. This is here at Smokey House. This is one of our research beds, but that's a raised bed in the forest, you know. But I've seen folks manage a system like this where maybe they've got a seed garden, for example. And so you've got a raised bed, and in that little footprint, maybe it's a little bit of an intensive impact, but in a very small area. And the plants in there are going to thrive because it's loose, nice soil. They're happy. And so like if you're just managing a specific small set of plants for high volumes of seed, that system might actually be great for you. So we'll be able to get to see some of this stuff in the woods, but I just want to highlight that. And not everyone has a perfect forested hillside, right? And so like sometimes you got to get creative.
What's that cardboard in that raised bed?
Well, I mentioned it was a research bed. This is me and Walker's like arguably kind of janky way to count 50 seeds. Because we were counting how many seeds ended up in these research beds so we could track germination. And we were trying to do it by hand, and it was like we're like fumbling seeds, and we were like, we got to come up with something. So cardboard and a drill, that's all you need. Okay, and I'm just really quickly highlighting this. This is a little outside our purview, but when you get into like a woods grown type system, and forest farming, I do want to just emphasize, is happening all over the world. It's happening all over the US. This is a forest garden. This is a community food forest system in Seattle. That's the Beacon Food Forest. Really neat. That's another photo from that system. And that's kind of like, you know, community garden style. A lot of these trees are planted in, but it's deriving food and medicine from woody plants and trees and things growing underneath them. This is another really neat system. This is out in the Pacific Northwest, but these are indigenous forest gardens that were maintained for hundreds of years and then were abandoned in the last, say, 100. And I'm working with a researcher through the New York Botanical Garden who works on these systems. And so it's just to highlight, these are really cool systems where...
What was that one called? Sorry to interrupt. The previous one?
That last one? Well, they're calling these forest gardens. It's like an indigenous forest garden.
Where was it?
This is in British Columbia.
Okay.
Yeah, but these kind of exist all down the Pacific Northwest into the US. And in these systems, which are generally just these monodominant Douglas fir forests, very low diversity, these are systems that have been maintained by dumping lots of like fish and oyster shells and doing things to modify that soil environment, raise the pH, occasional burning, and yeah, and so it's just to highlight that these systems exist all over the place. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It is really cool, but that's not where we are. If you're interested in forest gardening and some of the methods there, A really awesome all-around book is this Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. Janine Davis is a researcher at NC State, and Margaret, who's here with us today, works very closely with Janine. So this is like their programming. That's an awesome book. It has everything you would ever need on all kinds of forest farming, including some of this forest gardening. And then John Munsell, this is one of his former PhD students, Kathy Bukowski, and they wrote this great Community Food Forest Handbook. So you can ask John about that. But there are resources on all these different systems. So I wanted to highlight some of the different, going back to that slide of people sort of listing their motivations, right? There are different reasons that you might choose to forest farm, different rationales, and different things that you can accomplish. And one of those things is thinking about forest farming as a strategy for achieving ecosystem restoration or enhancement. And that's why I got that barberry there. So we're going to deal with it. So this is a really cool paper that came out in 2020 by somebody that was actually, Marlise, did you work with Michelle Spicer? Yeah. Really cool, where they set up all this research, and basically this is a comparison of diversity, species diversity in temperate and tropical forests, looking across vertical strata in the forest. So you can see in a tropical forest, the diversity, the different number of species, is actually at its sort of like maximum here in they're calling this the understory, but you could think of it as the midstory, shrubs, vines. In temperate forests, our forest floor, what we call the forest understory, has over 80% of the species in the forest are right there on the forest floor. So another thing I wanted to highlight is that the vast majority of our forests here in North America, our temperate forests, were either cut over or degraded at some point in the last 200 years. And many of the plants that we'll be talking about, things like ginseng and golden seal, these like long-lived perennial plants, are the last plants often to come back into a forest environment. So when we're talking about forest farming as a conservation strategy, we're talking about reintroducing native biodiversity to the forest floor, where maybe it's not there because that forest was cut over, it was pasture land for 60 years, right? So it's one way that we like to think about forest farming as a restoration strategy. So when we're talking specifically about wild simulated forest farming and thinking about reintroducing these plants into environments where they sort of would naturally occur, choosing the right site is really critical. And we're going to be able to think about this when we're out in the woods today. But I'm going to run through these really quick. These are a couple things you want to be thinking about when you go out back home at the end of the conference, if you haven't done this already, and you're like, all right, I want to look at my property and like where would be a great spot to do some wild simulated forest farming. So a couple key aspects that we want to think about. Well, no pun intended. One of them is aspect. Slope and aspect. So we generally find our natural communities of these shade-loving mesic forest herbs on north and east facing slopes. And does anybody have an idea as to why that might be? Cooler, exactly. So those north and east facing slopes are getting the morning sunlight. So generally there's higher soil moisture on those sites. These plants love moist soil. So it's really cool. This is true like all over the world. You go and look at a south versus a north facing slope and you'll often see totally different plant communities present on those two different aspects. So aspect is critical. I will say that as we get further north, and Walker keeps reminding this when we're out in the woods, that becomes less relevant, especially in very rich soils like we have here at Smokey House. So we always say like you might want to check out your north and east facing slopes first, but it doesn't mean don't go and check out your other areas too. And we always recommend if you're going to wild simulated forest farm, do some test plantings, like just throw some seed out, see if it works. Slope is also a kind of an important thing to consider. So many of the herbs, and I'm generalizing here because there's so many different plants that you can forest farm, but again, thinking maybe primarily about ginseng, golden seal, ramps, bloodroot, some of these maybe more commercially valuable species and often the focal species of these systems. can really like are looking for soil. They like high levels of soil moisture, but they don't want to be wet. And so a slope ensures that you're getting good drainage of moisture on that site. So that there's, and the best is when you've got like a little stream at the bottom of your slope, right? That tells you that there's water moving down that slope, but it's not pooling anywhere. And certain species will do a little better with different amounts, like ramps you can find a little closer down to the bottom of the stream. They can handle a little more, but that's something you do want to be thinking about. Slope is good. And again, I mentioned drainage is a big part of that. And so anywhere where you're seeing pooling water, generally speaking, is probably not a great place to go try and plant. And ramps being a little bit of the exception, they still don't want to be floating, even seasonally. They don't really like that so much. But you will find ramps growing down along the stream, certainly lower down than you will some of our other species. Shade levels and forest age. So generally speaking, an ideal forest farming site is mature. So we're generally, again, talking about second growth forest that was at one point cut, but mature forest is ideal. And these are generally bigger trees, more open understory. That's for lots of reasons. It's about the shade dynamics. It's about the root competition in that forest understory. So you're looking generally for a mature second growth forest with not a ton of dense, kind of like small competing trees in that environment. And generally speaking, closed canopy. So you'll often hear this 70 to 90% shade levels being ideal. And there's different tools you can use if you really want to get nerdy about it and get out there. There's something that I like using called a forest densitometer. Which is this little handheld thing with a mirror that you can look at, and that's kind of cool. The way I learned it was like the paper plate method, where you can put out a 10 by 10 grid of plates and count how many of them are getting sun. And you can also just look up, and if you're walking through the woods and it's a mature forest and you've got a closed canopy, that's kind of what we're looking for here. Soils, I mentioned these plants like mesic soils. Mesic is sort of just like, it's in between wet and dry. It's sort of like the Goldilocks zone of just right, where you've got good amounts of soil moisture, but it's not too wet, it's not too dry. And again, like some people will kind of get like, whoa, I don't know if my soil's quite right, like I should do a soil test. And I think we generally kind of are pushing the perspective that there are other ways you can get at that information indirectly that are probably a lot easier, they're cheaper, and generally speaking, like a soil test is almost like guaranteed to come back and make you go like, oh no, it's almost like, don't even, probably not worth it. I would say as an alternative, especially when you're just getting started, is to think about the other plants that you're finding in that growing environment. We refer to these as indicator species. The idea here being that what you're finding growing in that forest site are telling you something about the underlying conditions of the forest and of that site. So this is a non-exhaustive list, but generally speaking, when it comes to tree species, canopy species, things like sugar maple, basswood, white ash, yellow bud hickory, I would say red oak could be on this list, are going to tell you that you've got these mesic soil conditions. And so those are generally good species. Other oak species, red maple, something like blueberry, and generally speaking conifers are trees that are sort of telling you this might not be an ideal site. And again, these are all sort of like rules of thumb in a way, right? You should always do a test planting if you're not sure, but this can be very informative. And we can maybe, not right now, but we can get into like what each of these species kind of like are indicating, right? Like, but it's good to have a list like this to be checking off. And that's looking up. You can also look down. And looking at the understory community that exists in that site is a really great way to tell you, again, more information about the site itself. And so understory species like Christmas fern and maidenhair fern, trillium, baneberries, and blue cohosh, other forest understory plants. And actually, Anna, do you have any of Justin's books?
I do. We have them. Well, I'll talk about that during.
Cool. I don't want
We
to.
have them here.
Yeah, so Justin wrote a really awesome book that basically describes all the different indicator species.
It's a field guide.
Field guide. Yep.
So it's designed to bring out with you and identify and,
Yeah.
help you out.
Help you out. So those are some of our good species. Generally, if you've got lycopods or wintergreen or hay-scented fern, these are understory species that you might want to avoid planting directly in. So indicator species can be really helpful. Site prep. This is something to think about too. You know, going back to that photo where some folks were observing that there was a light thinning that had taken place, right? There are some things you can do to modify your site to get it ready for planting. Some things you might want to be thinking about are like these light thinnings, things like striped maple that are creating excessive shade. Those are things that you might want to consider cutting out. But I would say, you know, again, just like getting started, you don't need to go in and start trying to cut things. I wouldn't say that is like you don't need to go that route. But we can get into some of the nuance around, like some of my research actually has been on looking at these sort of ideal shade levels. And one thing we're finding is that you can actually have too much shade if you're interested in growing the plants like as a crop and getting them to grow quickly. So that's something that you can think about. Dealing with invasive species, in some cases, maybe doing some soil amending. Even in a wild simulated system, a soil amendment like gypsum, which adds calcium to the soil, can be helpful. And there's been some cool research in these very acidic red maple forests up in Canada, where like applying gypsum to the soil basically dramatically increased the survivability and productivity of their ginseng plantings. So again, these are things that might depend on the conditions of the site. You wouldn't need to do this in like the sites we have here at Smokey House are just awesome, right? So, but these are things that you can do. And then other things to think about, navigability, like super steep slope, but the plants might love it. But if you're gonna roll down the hill and end up at the bottom of the creek, maybe you don't wanna plant there. Airflow, this is another thing that's helpful, again, for sort of disease pressure, is like, you know, having good air circulation. Another reason why mature forest is preferable to something that's got a lot of small stems. So you want to think about that. And then security. This is not a huge issue in the Northeast, but it's an issue, and it's definitely an issue in Appalachia where I kind of got started. It's a big thing, is ginseng in particular gets poached, stolen from your land. So if you want to just be able to keep an eye on those plantings, if they can, you know, near your house, or some people go really crazy with this and cameras and alarms but yeah, booby traps. So I do just want to highlight, going back to thinking about those different production methods, you know, there is actually a lot of environments that you could use to grow these understory plants. And we do kind of like have this emphasis on what you might think of as your pristine, intact forest site. But you can also grow these herbs in an actively managed site that's being managed for timber, or in a degraded environment. And you might need to do more work, but it doesn't mean, like, if you don't have this perfect kind of pristine storybook forest, that you're out of luck. There's nothing you can do. So that's part of what we're exploring here at Smokey House, is like these different production methods and how can we match those with the site conditions to ensure that this is possible for anybody. So I guess just to say that another way, the way that you're approaching production does need to kind of be in line with the baseline conditions of your site. So you might need to lime the super acidic red maple forest if you want to grow ginseng. Okay, another thing I want to touch on, right, is that this is also an income generating activity. And so that's another reason that people are kind of getting into this practice. Just highlighting that non-timber forest products are a significant part of forest economies, and things like maple syrup production, growing mushrooms, and the herbs we're talking about are generating fair amounts of revenue, right, year after year in the US for folks. This is a really cool study that was done out of Virginia Tech by another one of John Munsell's PhD students, Steve Kruger, where he basically surveyed ginseng dealers across Appalachia and asked them, what other plants are you buying? Because this is actually one of the primary ways that people are selling these forest farm herbs for a long time, and even still, right, to this day. And so here are just like, you know, these 30% of ginseng buyers were also buying golden seal. And they were buying bloodroot and black cohosh and mayapple, Virginia snakeroot, trillium, blue cohosh. And so a lot of plants are actually being sold to these aggregators that are buying these plants wholesale, right, and then selling them up kind of the supply chain. So really interesting. This is not something that had been documented before. And the kind of key takeaway I want to highlight here is just that it's like actually a lot of plants and it's a fair amount of money. Also, I would say that the majority of these plants are probably being harvested from the wild. So another reason we talk about forest farming is if you think about this as a supply chain, right, of plants moving from forests in the US to be sold and bought by companies, like herbal products companies are buying a lot of this and selling that domestically, that's a lot of plant material leaving our forests. So forest farming is a way to make money and be part of the supply chain, but also divert that supply away from exclusively wild harvested. This is one of our growers that we work with in our mentorship program, Rick Falumley. He's based in Ohio. And something I think is awesome about Rick, he started full-time forest farming 10 years ago. Like he was an actuary before that and was like, I hate my job. Like I want to do something different. And Rick has just become like a forest farming powerhouse. And I think he's at every farmer's market. He's diversified. He's selling all kinds of different products. But something I feel like it's important to remind people is that when people are like, forest farming, I could make some money. It's like, well, that is true, but it's still farming. Like if you want to make money forest farming, then you have to approach it with the tenacity of a farmer. I think some people think it's like a side thing, including like my dad, was like, ginseng, like let's do this. I was like, you don't want to do this, Dad. I know you don't. So Rick is awesome, and he's gone full-time. He forest farms full-time. I said he was an actuary, so these are his numbers. He's a big numbers guy. But Rick is thinking very creatively about how to derive the most value out of the plants and the products he's selling. So he gets creative. And I'd love to spend more time talking about this, but I'm going to keep going. But just to highlight some of the opportunities to make sales, right? The kind of market opportunities. You've got wholesale markets, like I mentioned. That's just selling those roots, harvesting the roots and selling them as is, maybe drying them, selling them into the wholesale market. But then retail opportunities, so like those local health food stores and apothecaries, like these are local markets that if you could make those connections and approach somebody and say, hey, I'm actually growing golden seal, would you be interested? People will be interested, and you can get good prices selling that way. I mentioned farmers markets, that's another outlet, like Rick sells potted ginseng plants, potted black cohosh. And it's like he'll sell a single plant for $20, right? And like all of a sudden you're like, well, it's a pretty good return, right? So people get creative. The products, you might be selling whole roots. You might be making value-added products. Things like tinctures, right? Ginseng leaf increasingly is there's a market for ginseng leaf. That's sort of new. And then also selling planting stock, and this is something that we're actually working on through the NFFC, is trying to develop the local planting stock market. But if you've got a seed garden and you're like, I've got locally grown ginseng seed, I promise you people will want to buy that because they're asking me. So they want to buy it. And the prices could be pretty good for something like that. As far as your largest costs, again, with like a wild simulated system, it can be very low, but we're talking about your time and your labor, probably the biggest, buying the plant material in the first place, and then infrastructure. If you decide you're going to do anything like build raised beds, right, there's a cost there. So those are things to think about. Just to quickly highlight the barriers, like why isn't everyone doing this? It sounds awesome. Well, historically the problem has been there's been a lack of technical information. Some of what we're trying to kind of present here, how do you actually do this stuff? It can be difficult to actually source the planting material. I mentioned that's a big part of the future of what our work is really kind of tailored toward, is thinking about cracking that nut and making plants available. And then the markets, like they're a little bit uncertain. It's not like you can just go to the store that buys all the forest farm plants. You got to get a little creative. And so for some people, that can be a big barrier. I won't spend a ton of time on this, but thinking more broadly about forest farming and agroforestry in general, when compared to say like, conventional agriculture or even the kind of assistance that exists around growing something like strawberries, there's a need for just like more resources around these forest farm crops. So that's something that we're working on and others are as well. And it's a big part of why we decided to create the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition. So we started this in 2020 and was really modeled off of work that was happening in Appalachia. And again, I'll just highlight, like, if you get the chance to talk to John Munsell, you should. He kind of like really pioneered this work in Appalachia. And so we really based a lot of what we're doing off of their work there. Funded by the USDA, which was huge. And really the goal from the beginning was to just make resources available, bring people together around forest farming. And so, like Walker mentioned, this is really cool. It's definitely a full circle thing to be able to pull off a conference like this. So hoping to just bring some of this assistance to the region. This is the footprint kind of the NFFC, the primary sort of research and demonstration sites that we set up in 2020. And in the years since then, we've hosted events kind of all across the Northeast. So it's also really cool. Part of this, these are research sites too, that are like long-term research sites. So it's been really neat. Nat is in the back. Nat spent the summer with me collecting data on these sites. And it's really cool to see the differences in how these plants grow across their range. I'm getting the time check, so I'm gonna skip through this as some of what we do. We do research, education. We're running a mentorship program. This is just highlighting some of the accomplishments of the program over the last few years. And something I wanted to kind of point out is that in the last 30 or so years, 40 years, forest farming assistance has really grown, right? And this is something that you can kind of track over time. This is us, founded here in 2020, around then. But we're seeing the creation of these new regional coalitions. There's a new Midwest Forest Farmers Coalition that just started. And there's also been this movement to creating an American Forest Farming Association that would exist like a professional association, kind of like SAF, the Society of American Foresters, something like that. So it's a good time to be getting into forest farming. That's what we're trying to say. If you want to get involved, talk to us, right? Like, we're definitely always kind of recruiting folks into the fold. Really happy that you're all here and that you're all interested. We want to stay plugged in and connected with what you're doing. There's always opportunities to host workshops through us and to move into kind of like a leadership role. So that's kind of been the model, is bringing people in. Maybe they're receiving a training, but then the following year they're actually hosting a training. So that's something to think about. We can work with you on that. If you want more information, that's our website. But that's all I have. We're going to get out into the woods now. So thanks, everyone.